So I'll start off with Amanda Martin. She's the Deputy Chief Resilience Officer with the state of North Carolina. Amanda is passionate about building resilience in ways that advance economic prosperity, strengthen housing options, and celebrate cultural and natural heritage. In her current work with the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, she advances the state's resilience through policy advising, stakeholder engagement, and technical assistance. She completed her PhD in City and Regional Planning at UNC Chapel Hill. Another alum, guys, racking them up in this class, where her dissertation examined post-disaster home buyouts in North Carolina from the perspective of resilience, recovery, and racial justice. Amanda has over a decade of experience in climate resilience, disaster recovery, and community development. She holds a master's in city planning from MIT and a bachelor's degree from Harvard. She lives with her wife and 2 children in Durham, North Carolina. And their names are Juno and Henry, in case you want to know. So with having said that, we are recording. The recording will be made public on the Coastal Resilience website. I will also try to get it to you students through our Sakai site as soon as possible. And Amanda, if you don't mind leaving us with a copy of your PowerPoint slides, I'll also make those available to you students in Sakai. I know we're a little behind on uploading those materials, but hopefully we'll get back on the stick now that we're halfway through this semester. So Amanda, you can start sharing your screen and take it away.
Thank you.
You're so welcome.
Get this set up. All right. Can everybody see my presentation? I'm seeing head nods. Okay. Wonderful. So my name is Amanda Martin. I'm Deputy Chief Resilience Officer with the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. I joined the office, which we call NCORR for short. I joined the office almost 2 years ago, and I'll give you a little bit of the big picture about where our office came from. Actually, I have an overview slide. I'll give you a big picture about government role and resilience and our agency. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about a lot of different resilience efforts that are ongoing. I'm going to try to stay out of the weeds of the project so that I can cover a lot of ground and then see what you all are interested in hearing more about. And then I'll leave you with one thought that I've been having about the resilience field that I've started presenting on sometimes that I'd be interested in your reactions to. And I'll talk a little bit about, I don't know, I said I would talk about careers in resilience. I guess I'll talk about my career in resilience and some things that I've noticed with the field and how we're hiring. So I guess I wanted to start with this big picture of what are government roles in resilience, because this is something that when we came into this job, and when I say we, right now there are 3 people who are, their title and job description are all about resilience in North Carolina. And when we came into this job, we didn't have job descriptions. And basically the mission was help the state advance resilience. And I will say I live with 2 cats and 2 children, and sometimes they visit while I'm on Zoom or WebEx. So any of y'all who have pets or kids, I'm sure understand. But I learned recently that you can actually hear my cats when they are in my closet office with me. So bear with me if you hear them. Anyway, so when we came into our positions, it's just there are so many ways that resilience can play a role in, or that so many ways that government can play a role in resilience. And sometimes we can be biased by our own professional backgrounds about what role we think that should be. But I put this slide up to offer you some big picture thoughts about what the government role can be, or many roles can be. It can be, I'm just going to go left to right, across the screen, it can be a federal, state, regional, or local government, and we think about what's the right role for government at those different levels. The things that we want local government to do for resilience are probably pretty different from what we want the federal government. And furthermore, they're authorized to do very different things. Similarly, we look executive level action versus legislative actions, very distinct in our federal system right now, and in our state system we have a politically divided executive and legislative branch, so you really see what the differences are that you can do in those different kinds of government. We can do planning. I'm a planner by trade, so I think all about planning all the time, or we can provide mandates or incentives for other governments or other groups to do planning. Governments can run programs for construction, recovery, post-disaster recovery, land acquisition, buyouts. Those are the programs where we provide funding for private landowners, property owners to do something to become more resilient or help their community become more resilient. There's conservation and natural resources management. A lot of what we do in terms of our natural resources affects resiliency, and of course, resilience extends to the ecological realm as well. We can also do capacity building, training, and education to help create champions and knowledgeable experts in resilience in other governments and other organizations in the private sector. So that's a role that the government can play. Another big one that we might immediately jump to is governments can create legal standards for the private sector or for the public sector. And really, standards is a very broad term, but we might think about things like construction standards, how we build, where we build, what kinds of reports or considerations need to be included when we issue permits, for example. The government plays a large role in funding infrastructure, of course, and infrastructure has a big effect on our resilience. Government also can play a role in stakeholder relationships and community cohesion, which are some of the softer elements of resilience that are still really important in terms of coping when a disaster happens. And this is something we've absolutely seen with COVID, where some aspects of what we've worked on with respect to disaster and climate resilience in terms of building stakeholder relationships have served immediately to the COVID response and recovery. So you really see where the idea of being resilient to any kind of shock is supported by some of these things that are a little bit harder to define, like stakeholder relationships or local capacity, civic capacity. And then finally, leadership is an important part of the government role in resilience, right? Because government officials are in a place where they get media coverage, they get attention, they get political attention. And so it's important for government to be out there championing resilience as a sort of concept and as what it looks like in the day-to-day. So there's a few big picture ideas about the government roles that you might imagine could be possible or we could be building on to become more resilient. In terms of North Carolina, this is our tagline slide, a new office with a dedicated focus. So we were created by the legislature in 2018 after Hurricane Florence, and the initial charge of the office was to administer several hundred million, basically at this point, $1 billion in disaster recovery funds from Hurricanes Matthew and Florence. So we got stood up. I think our official start date was January 1st, 2019. Jumping down a bullet, the resilience team, which is those 3 people that I talked about us having right now, we were staffed in 2019, starting kind of in the middle of the year, late spring. Because our office has had and built some successful mechanisms for distributing disaster recovery aid, we were asked to administer some significant funding that came down from the federal government related to eviction prevention, specifically helping people pay rent and utilities, helping people who are behind on rent and utilities cover those costs so that they can stay in their homes. This program is called HOPE. You may have seen about it, talked about it. I can talk a little bit about it if there are questions. I'm going to focus mostly on what our resilience team does, but there's a reason we're all in the same office, because it is related. And then one final thing to note is that the Office of Recovery and Resiliency is a sibling agency to North Carolina Emergency Management. We share the same director, Director Sprayberry, and that allows us to work closely with emergency management. There are some funds that go to emergency management from FEMA. Our funds, the funds that we handle come from HUD. So we want to be making sure that these funds play nice together, and that for people who are survivors of disaster, they don't care where their funds come from. They don't care which agency is administering it. So we want to give them as seamless an experience as possible. So we work closely with emergency management. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story of the resilience work that we're doing. A lot of it starts in Executive Order 80, which is an executive order that was issued by Governor Cooper in 2018 in the fall, and it's called North Carolina's Commitment to Address Climate Change and the Transition to a Clean Energy Economy. And it had several sections. Almost all of the sections had to do with climate change mitigation related to energy issues. However, there was this section 9, and I just copied over the text of it. I'm not going to read it out loud, but so you can scan it and see some of the key words. But basically, it called for all of the cabinet agencies to come together and prepare a climate risk assessment and resiliency plan. And this plan was, I gave it to Anna to share with you all. I hope that some of you were able to take a look at it or look at some part of it that you were interested in. The result is this, the North Carolina Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan. And whenever I talk about this plan, I like to acknowledge we had such tremendous help from outside partners to put this together. There's no funding for us associated with putting this together, and that's a reality of being in a state agency. Is sometimes you get tasked to do things and you have no spare staff or funding to do them. And so we had a lot of assistance from NOAA, federal agency, and also from the National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center, better known as NEMAC, which is out of UNC Asheville. We had over 50 scientists help with the climate science report between writing it and reviewing it. We also had we had input from the Department of Environmental Quality, Environmental Justice and Equity Advisory Board. And I was really excited. I didn't know that Julia Cardwell was in this class, but she messaged me. So Julia was staff at DEQ, and she was really instrumental in putting together the climate justice chapter, which I was the lead author for. And so I guess I can share a public thank you to Julia. She did some incredible mapping for us. And also I'm sure she would share her experience of being called into this work, and how you sometimes have a very short amount of time to put together something that is going to get a lot of media attention, and kind of what goes into trying to put together something that's really high quality, because we all went through it. We went through it together, especially writing that particular chapter. I did want to walk through the contents of the plan because I know that you all looked at it, so I can give you a little bit more context for how this came together. The executive summary, key findings and recommendations, basically distilling everything else in the plan, and the resilience plan development process just described what we did. But then starting with the North Carolina Climate Science Report summary. So it was a summary of a longer report that's an appendix, but basically we were tremendously lucky and are grateful to have had scientists who are willing to take the national climate assessment, the 4th national climate assessment, which had recently come out, and downscale their modeling and analysis to North Carolina. So it used all the same models that the National Climate Assessment had used, but then we have the state-specific report. And it's really powerful because it's it's not just front matter for this plan. It's something that we can reference in any presentation that we do. It provides graphics. It's very careful in its language to talk about how confident we are in each of the projections and what these different confidence levels is. It reflects all of what scientists have learned about science communication in climate change work. So that was a fantastic resource. Chapter 4 is our climate and environmental justice chapter. This one is near and dear to my heart. We worked really hard on it, and at the same time, it is a first step in addressing the issues with inequities that are married into resilience. And if there's more interest in talking about some of those issues, I'd be happy to do that. Then we had chapter 5, which is the big fat chapter. And this is where the plan goes into different sectors of life, society, to talk about resilience. And here it's interesting, there was always a little bit of tension here between, was this a plan for what state agencies needed to do related to resilience, or was this a plan more broadly for what we wanted to happen? And I know several of you are in the Masters in Planning program, so I wanted to, if any of you are taking planning theory with Nikhil Kaza, I don't know if he still teaches it, but he teaches this book by, the guy's last name is Hopkins. I wish I could see your faces, because either you'd be like, what is she talking about? Or I know exactly what you're talking about. Anyway, if any of you have had to read that book, it's a very difficult read, but something really fantastic that he talks about. Okay, I'm seeing yes. Okay, so I had to read it when I took planning theory, and then I was a TA for the class. And when I read it for planning theory, I was like, this is insane. And then when I TA'd it, I was like, I get it, because he talks about all the different things that plans do. And this is a little bit of a digression, but you'll see why I'm talking about it, because plans can be, in some ways, we think of the best practice of a plan as being a to-do list that's really easy to follow. It's like, check this, here's how we'll do it, we'll get it done, check this, check that. But actually what Hopkins says, and what is true, is that not all plans actually function that way. Sometimes you want plans to be an inspiration. Sometimes you want them to be a big picture that make other people go into their to-do mode. Sometimes you want to suggest things that somebody else can implement, but you actually have no control over whether or not they're going to do it. Sometimes you want to set policy in your plans. So there's a lot of different things that plans can do, and we tried to straddle a few of those in the climate risk assessment and resilience plan. And as you go through some of these sectors, if you're particularly interested in one or the other, you'll see this kind of balance between, we are the cabinet agencies, we are the executive branch. We control really just what the executive branch can do and what our agencies are authorized to do. But sometimes that doesn't feel like enough, because that's a very narrow piece of the puzzle, and a lot of other levels of government and non-governmental actors have a role to play in resilience. So you'll see in these sectors how we've balanced, in some of the sectors more than others, actions that can be taken outside of our individual agency mandates. Then chapter 6 is nature-based solutions to resilience, a fantastic chapter on green infrastructure and the ways in which conservation land management can support resilience. And then chapter 7 is the path forward. And this is really what we see as the mission of our resilience team within the Office of Recovery and Resiliency. So we like to go back to it, figure out how what we're doing fits into that chapter 7, use the principles that are laid out in that chapter. It's really helpful to have a small document that provides so much agreed upon guidance, and it's been adopted by the governor. And so that's always an important source of authority and confidence for the work that we're doing. Okay, so then what do you do all day? This is our former Chief Resilience Officer. This is not what we do all day. I just think it's a funny picture to show someone, next to a culvert. especially during COVID. I sit at my desk all day. But let me tell you a little bit about some of the work that we're doing. So one thing we do is we staff the State Disaster Recovery Task Force, which is a body whose mission is to facilitate communication and collaboration across a number of different areas related to disaster recovery and resilience. It's a sort of unwieldy body, and it functions through subcommittees. And we have 12 subcommittees, but only about 6 of them are active because it takes a lot to work with each of them and to set up agendas and to move their work forward. This is all of the different subcommittees. We call them recovery support functions because it's related to emergency management, and emergency management has a lot of its own lingo. So we call them recovery support functions, or RSFs. But basically they're subcommittees that get together on a regular, semi-regular basis to look at issues of recovery and resilience, to share information, and to look at ways that we can improve what the state is doing and what the constituent members of these subcommittees are doing. And I should have mentioned that the task force is comprised of both state agencies and non-state agencies. We try to have as much statewide coverage as possible. So, for example, our nonprofit partners, we try to get nonprofits that represent the whole state in some ways, although sometimes that's not possible or feasible. But we don't include, for example, local government because we don't want to sort of favor one local government over the other by including them in this body. So it's an advisory body. Again, I'm going to leave it at that, but happy to talk more about what this group does or what we do with them. Another big effort we're working on is the Resilient Communities Program. And this is something that's called for in Chapter 7 of the Risk Assessment Resilience Plan. And I start with this slide because it's a justification for what we're doing. Communities and regions can solve tremendous resilience challenges. There's a lot that we can do at the state level, but there's a lot that should happen at the local level or at the regional level. And sometimes it's because it's for political reasons. Sometimes it's what local governments are authorized to do, particularly with respect to guiding land use decisions. Sometimes you really want local buy-in on something that has a big local effect. You don't want it to come from the state. But then sometimes it's because communities have really important knowledge about what will make them resilient. And there's no way at the state level that we can hold all of that knowledge. We can't get to every community or every region. And so with attention to that, this comes from, again, the Risk Assessment Resilience Plan. We've talked with many community leaders and asked them what they need to do resilience-related work. And their response was access to expertise, technical support for analysis and planning, and funding to implement measures that advance long-term resilience. So these are some of the things that also are unevenly distributed across the state. So our cities tend to have greater municipal resources, greater ability to do in-depth planning like resilience planning. Compared with our rural communities, you might have one staff person who's wearing the hat that 10 different staff people would be wearing in the hats of 10 different staff people in a city. And they just don't have the bandwidth to do resilience planning or to take a resilience lens. So this program is all about making some of that stuff happen. Our goals are to build local capacity for the work of resilience, including assessments, planning, project development, implementation, to provide technical assistance for those things it doesn't make sense to build local capacity for, and then to supply funds to plan and implement projects that support resilience. Some of these program goals we are currently funded to do, and other ones we're working on. So let's see, I'm actually going to skip that slide. So there are two, we're implementing the resilient communities in 2 different agencies. We're implementing it in our office and at NCORR in collaboration with the Rural Center. And then the Department of Environmental Quality and the Division of Coastal Management, DCM, they're also implementing it, and we're doing it in 2 slightly different flavors, but collaborating really closely on it. So our program is called RISE, and I said it's Resilient Communities, NCORR, and Rural Center Style. It's a collaboration with a nonprofit, the North Carolina Rural Center, really fantastic nonprofit, used to be part of state government, split off, and now they're independent. This project is going to develop a statewide resiliency guide, so consistent guidance on doing resilience planning for communities or for local leaders outside of government across the state. So something tailored to North Carolina, empowering, helps people do planning if they have access to really cool, exciting data, also helps them do planning if they don't have access to that data. We're also doing leadership training, and this part is being led by the Rural Center. They have a model for their leadership training that we've adapted to include some resilience content. Local leadership and leadership in general is so important to resilience. You really want to have champions for resilience in different sectors, in different places. That's one of the key things the research has shown that's correlated with true implementation of resilience work. So we're doing leadership training. And then we're running this program called a Regional Resilience Portfolio Program. And the idea with this program is for regions to come together and, ideally this might work on a watershed basis. It's probably going to look more like our councils of government, collecting a partnership of actors and stakeholders who are interested in advancing their region's resilience, and to walk them through a process that's not too different from a traditional planning process in terms of meeting periodically, doing some analysis, helping them understand their vulnerability. We have funding for some in-depth technical mapping that we hope will support the process. But instead of writing a traditional plan, right, and here we come back to what I was saying earlier about Hopkins' work, we think that it's more realistic especially in rural regions, instead of having a plan that has 100 potential strategies, we want these regions to end up with a portfolio of maybe 5, 8, 10 strategies that are really well thought out, where they have gotten buy-in, they've identified potential partners, everyone agrees it's a good idea. They've thought about where they're going to fund it or how they could fund it. Basically getting these partnerships, regional partnerships, to the place where they might be competitive for implementation funding. And this is a big lesson learned from our disasters that we've had, is that sometimes it rains money from the federal government, and it's amazing when that happens. But if you're not ready to go out and collect it, if you don't know exactly what you want to spend it on, it's hard to make it just come your way. And that disadvantages a lot of communities that don't have that. We call them sometimes shovel-ready projects with respect to construction projects. They don't have something where you can immediately start permitting and building or restoring or whatever the project is. These things are complicated, they take time, and this program is designed to provide that time and capacity and bandwidth to get to the point where regions know what projects they want to do to make themselves more resilient and can articulate what they are, what the benefit is, how they'll get there to potential funders. So I mentioned that Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ, is also running a program. They have this cool logo. We don't have a logo yet. Their program is called the Resilient Coastal Communities Program. Theirs is a little bit different, which reflects that a lot of our coastal jurisdictions are a little bit further along in dealing with resilience and natural hazards management, risk management, mitigation types of issues. And many of those jurisdictions have more people or more resources, not all of them by any means, but there are some reasons that our coastal communities are a little bit further along in some of these conversations. So their program will provide direct support for resilience planning in local jurisdictions, more of a traditional planning process focused on creating a resilience plan. They've had an application period for communities. It can be municipal or county level participants, and they also had an application period for consultants to apply, and they're doing some matchmaking work to find the right communities and the right consultants. And I should say we have different funding sources as well for the NCORR program and for the DEQ program. So that also reflects some of these differences that you'll see. Something really exciting is that DEQ also has implementation funding for at least one project, and it must be related to green infrastructure per their funding source. But also it's a really exciting opportunity to do a green infrastructure project and to elevate examples of the kinds of resilient construction or land management that we would want to see happen. So another thing that we are working on is something we're calling the North Carolina Flood Resilience Framework. Sometimes it's been called a Flood Resilience Blueprint. I want to say upfront, this is the concept in development. This is not something we are currently building out. It is not yet funded, but we've started developing this concept and shopping it around. We call it socializing it so that people start to recognize, oh, that's that thing that so-and-so is talking about, and to look at funding opportunities. So this would be a volume-based, watershed-based model of how water moves throughout the state. So a lot of the work that we do with risk management, it can only deal, there's a kind of a few elements that, a few gaps that this will fill. One is that we know a lot about how water moves in our very large river watershed systems, but we have a lot of creeks in North Carolina, and a lot of the flooding comes from those smaller sources. A lot of the, backyard creeks creep up and up and up. It also addresses the need to work at the watershed level. A lot of times, our analysis can be limited to political or administrative jurisdictions. And that's not how water flows. Water doesn't really care. So instead of having, a project about sizing culverts in one jurisdiction and then the next jurisdiction downstream is making a different decision, we want to be encouraging all of those decisions to be made together. So we're calling it a framework because it should be what we call a decision support tool. It shouldn't just spit out the decision. It should help users evaluate alternatives and understand the pros and cons of what different decisions would look like. So particularly when we think about investing in dams or levees or land acquisition even, where would be the most impactful place to invest those public funds, and how can we make sure that a project in one jurisdiction again won't be a disadvantage or cause worse flooding problems downstream. And here we're building on work that's been done in other states. Louisiana, Iowa, and Virginia have all taken to varying degrees steps towards this type of work, if you're looking for other examples. I did want to pull out from Chapter 7 a few other things that are named that we're working on. I talked about the Resilient Communities program. We've also convened a dedicated interagency resilience team, and that's a staff level team, people who get together who are a little closer to doing the work than the high kind of secretary level designees. This is more staff level. It's a place where it's supposed to be a space where we don't have to present to the outside world that we know everything and we're doing a great job and everything's very successful. We can kind of be a little bit more inward and say, hey, did you try this? Hey, this isn't working that great. What did you do in this situation? And to generally collaborate. Oh, what model are you using? Oh, you're making this program. You're doing this grant funding. It's already been a really great space for that to happen. We've only met a handful of times. And one thing this interagency resilience team is doing, which is called for in the plan, is to create annual agency resilience reports. And the first round of reports just came in. It's supposed to be a look back on what agencies are doing with respect to resilience and what they have planned for the future. And so it's our first time doing them. They were due on March 1st. So there's kind of some different, we're getting a variety of kinds of reports from the agencies, and we'll learn from the variety as we go forward about what's working best for the agencies. But it's kind of an accountability mechanism to show how the agencies are continuing to work on resilience issues, and a touch point for the public, for the governor, to coalesce on resilience. Another thing we're working on is creating an online toolbox for climate data and resources. This is in pretty early stages, but the need's been articulated so many times that we know we want to do it. And right now we're in the phase of scoping out what actually that toolbox looks like. Are we going to agree on particular climate scenarios to use across different types of users or different agencies? What will be helpful to local governments? What's already out there? There's a lot of data toolboxes, mapping stuff out there. So right now we're doing that ground level work, and really our state climate office has led that work with us. They're over at North Carolina State University. They're a really fantastic resource, very interested in making climate data usable and useful. Other resilience team activities. Again, I'm just going to basically say these in case there's interest in hearing more about them. We're helping our agency. So our agency has the funds that come from HUD usually are called block grants, which means block grant means the recipient gets to decide how they want to use the money. And the federal government approves of those uses. They say, here's a variety of what you can do. You decide what you need. So we have some block grant funding from HUD for mitigation. It's a new kind of block grant funding that HUD just started giving out. So we're helping our agency think about a particular category of use of those funds. We wrote a resilience quick start guide for local communities that want to do resilience work but aren't really sure what that is or what it looks like. We supported BRIC, which is the new FEMA program building resilient infrastructure and communities. So we helped, that goes through emergency management, but we supported them in administering the first round of BRIC funds. We're working on a guide on local planning and zoning for resilience, provide some specific language and guidance on where resilience fits into your comp plan and your zoning, your development ordinances, and supporting other NCORR programs like strategic buyout. And there's always a lot of interest in buyout. So we can talk a little bit about that too, if you want. So I wanted to conclude, as I said, with a thought about the field of resilience. It's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. And it came up, let me just talk about it and then I'll talk about the context in which this has come up, which is more than one context. So I think with climate resilience, our field tends to focus a lot on the physical impacts of climate change. And that's a really important piece. And when I say physical impacts, I'm talking about the folks who do fantastic science related to climate and climate impacts, modeling, mapping, the folks who work on infrastructure and thinking about what we do to protect our communities, and also about land use. How do we plan and develop communities in ways that keep residents safe? What can we do with the land use that we already have to make our communities safer? And those are really important components, and I am not going to downplay them in any way. But what I think is that sometimes we have not balanced that with a discussion about societal impacts. And when I say societal impacts, I gave a few big picture examples here: business recovery, health issues or unhealthy conditions that people are living in, housing security or housing insecurity. And these are important because they are the ways that communities actually experience climate change. A lot of us who are really focused on resilience can get very caught up in mapping, for example. But mapping is not always a fantastic communication tool. It might help us do the analysis and help us make decisions about where to put investments. But when you're talking to residents in a small town, they probably don't want to look at a map. They probably want to tell you about what happened when it flooded and how bad it was and how no one actually came from the media and took a picture until the floodwater had already receded, so no one will ever know. Those kinds of stories are actually much more important to people on the ground. And similarly, the kinds of resources that help them recover or don't help them recover are very impactful and front of mind for a lot of residents. And actually, they're the most meaningful thing is, if you're living in a mold-ridden house 3 years after a disaster, probably the most important thing for you and for your family is how you can find good housing and how you can find healthy housing. And those are really important issues for us as resilience professionals to recognize and address and treat with as much levity as we do the physical impacts. And I think this is important from a climate justice perspective, because I think when we look just at physical impacts, we start to overlook the fact that communities that are already burdened by inequality, by racism, by unhealthy conditions, by environmental justice issues, by even, like family obligations. Those are the kinds of things that actually really do interplay with your ability to cope with a disaster. Do you have family members nearby that you can go stay with or borrow money from if you need until your insurance payment comes through? Those are actually really important pieces that affect how climate change affects society and help us understand why climate change is so unequal. In addition to it being a climate justice issue, I think this is also an issue where we can find some partisan agreement, if that makes sense. Because you may hear people say, and I'm generally of this mind, that it doesn't really matter if people think climate change is caused by humans or not, when you're talking about how to cope with it. And basically that means when you're going to ground and trying to figure out where water can safely be in a community is not the time to talk about what's causing climate change. And when we're talking about where water can be in a community, we're talking about where businesses can survive. We're talking about where whole towns can survive and thrive, where your housing stock can be safe, where your tenants, your renters are going to be safe. And those are issues that people care about across the partisan spectrum. So I'm not sure if I've completely articulated that as cleanly as it feels in my mind, but I'd be happy to talk more about it if you're your thoughts on it. But I think that there's something here about balancing those physical impacts and the societal impacts that actually help us get to some of the deep divisions that are creating barriers to climate resilience work, including both equity, climate justice, and partisan divide issues. So I see I'm out of time. A final slide about careers in resilience. So I'll just share my career. I worked between getting both of my graduate degrees, and I worked after my undergrad. I worked a lot of jobs. I worked in a lot of restaurants. Do not feel like you are, behind if you are also working at a supermarket right now, and that's not what you want to do with your career. I've totally been there. And a few things that just to kind of the field needs everyone that we can get. We need people who can do advanced GIS analysis. We need people who can tell stories and make art. We need people who are excellent group facilitators, and we need people who can get up and do public speaking. Whatever you feel like your skills are, I guarantee that we need them in this field. Something I say to people who are interested in resilience work. Your job might not say resilience in the title when you get it. And that's kind of can make it difficult to look for a field in the look for a job in the resilience field. You might have to dig a little bit deeper into the kinds of issues that a job that you'd be working on to figure out if it is related to resilience. So don't limit your job search terms to that. A few thoughts from personal experience. I just shared one. Another is that I think when because I know several of you are in the master's program, I remember feeling really caught up about which specialization to be in. And that has turned out to matter almost 0% in the kinds of jobs that I was able to get. So don't stress about your specialization being perfect or not perfect. I was hired for my first real planning job because I could use Excel and I wasn't afraid of numbers. And I had I had all this environmental background, consensus building, public participation. And they were like, no, we need somebody who can make fractions. And I was like, great, okay, I'm your person. I can do that. And slowly I worked in the work that I wanted to do, which was related to social equity and related to climate resilience. So don't stress if you don't feel like you're being hired for the right thing at first, or if you don't feel like you're getting the right job at first, or if you don't get a job right away. I guess just all those things felt like such a big deal when I was getting into this field, and looking back, it didn't actually matter that much where, how things got started for me. Anywhere where you feel like you can make a difference, or you can get to know people, or you can stand out, or you can do the thing you want to do, there's lots of good reasons to take a job. And the final thing I wanted to say is to reach out to professionals, no matter what field you're going into. I have some folks reach out to me, which is really fantastic. And I've also noticed that the people who reach out to me are generally really well prepared and really confident, and that it's awesome again. But don't feel like you have to be prepared and confident and know everything to reach out to people in the field that you think maybe you want to work in, because I think that skews who winds up making those professional connections. So I just encourage everyone to reach out and do that kind of informational interviewing thing. Find people you admire, and don't worry if you don't think, you're not sure if your email sounds right or if you're ready to have that conversation. So with that, I will conclude. This is my thank you slide, and I will stop sharing.
Wonderful. Amanda, thank you so much. You hit on a lot of the questions that I received from the students ahead of class. But in particular, I really appreciate your advice at the end is just, chill, everything's going to be good. So to begin with, let me see who's in the chat. Okay, yes. Okay, synonyms to jobs that deal with resilience, but aren't titled that specifically. That's a good question, because there's lots of ways to communicate what we call resilience, but you don't necessarily have to use that word, especially if you're in an environment where that's a touchy subject. So Amanda, any thoughts?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts, and then if other people have other ideas too. It depends, because resilience work happens in different fields. If you're looking for jobs in emergency management, you might look for things that say hazard mitigation. If you're looking in the environmental, ecological type of field, that's one where a ton of different jobs may relate back to resilience. Looking for jobs with landscape or even conservation or natural resource management, resilience may wind up being a part of that. For housing, a lot of different kinds of housing positions tend to wind up dealing in some way with resilience, especially in North Carolina, because we've had so many natural disasters. I don't think I have a keyword there, but maybe just read read job descriptions or find out what organizations are doing. Trying to think of other.
Well, I do know that we also have in the class a couple of transportation planning students.
Yay.
And so that's a big thing in
Mm-hmm.
transportation, just infrastructure in general, but in particular, I believe it was Kristen used the quote, we're called the good roads state because we plastered roads everywhere, which was a good thing, lots of access.
But I will say, Department of Transportation is doing some of the best resilience work of any of the agencies in the state. So they have put together different people from different parts of their agency to talk about their resilience strategy, where they can fund, where they can create a resilience metrics or criteria to use in funding decisions. So yes, roads plus minus in general for resilience, but the people who are doing transportation planning, a lot of them really understand this issue. And it's really exciting to see. And that's might not be true in every state, but it's really true in North Carolina.
Well, that's great. Does anybody have a follow-up question dealing with, I don't know, the broad range of infrastructure and whatnot? Anybody? Okay, well, let's move on to another issue that kept coming up was politics. And, you know, how do you deal with the political climate that you're working in? And does it change? Well, I know you've only been there for 2 years. The whole agency's only existed for 2 years. But there's going to be a flip. There always is, from, you know, one side to the other in our General Assembly. So what are your thoughts on that? Like, do you have any particular, I don't know if advice is the word, but observations about the political side?
Yeah, and one nice thing about flood resilience especially is that nobody wants floods. Nobody benefits. And so there's sort of a common starting point, which is really helpful. And I think we are very cognizant of the language that we use and the points that we emphasize, because we do want to try to speak to the important values that are front and center to different state constituents. And we work for the governor, and we always want to, he's my ultimate boss. So I always want to highlight the fantastic work that he's done. And also in some places, that's not the best starting point. You want to understand more what are the core issues that folks care most about. And sometimes in a more conservative context, it might be about talking about what's most cost effective. And that's something truly we care so much about, because to solve the resilience problems, it's going to be massively expensive. There's no way that actually we can afford all of what we need. And so we have to be really careful about where we spend public funds and make sure that they're doing the most good. So we are very cognizant of the political differences and how, down the line and in the weeds that can create some disagreements about how things get done. And also we're at this point where nobody needs to be convinced in North Carolina that there's a problem. We've just lived it so many times in different ways that we're past having a conversation about whether we need to care about this issue. And we're ready to have a conversation about how we can experience less pain from flooding, from natural hazards.
Yeah, well, sometimes past experiences is the best selling point that we've got, unfortunately, but that's human nature for you.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody else have any questions they want to bring up at this time, or want me to pop back on my list? Not seeing anything. Oh, I did see in the chat, Amanda gave her contact information there, so that's great. And it was also on her last slide, so when we get the slides, you'll have it there as well. Let me bring up one from Emma. You had a question, an interesting question about the pandemic. Do you want to talk about that? Finding a brochure?
Yeah, pulling it up now. Oh, yes. So I noticed that pandemics were listed as one of the non-climate stressors. And I was just wondering how, obviously we're in a current pandemic, so wondering just how this affected, what the process of developing this report. I believe it came out June 2020, is that, if I'm remembering correctly? But I was just wondering if I was like helping finalize reports as the pandemic was starting, and I know we were trying to figure out how to incorporate that into our reports, and wondering, how did it affect the development of the plan, but also just considerations that were built in.
Yeah, that is a great question. And there's not probably one answer to it. I will say, for example, like you just brought up, this plan was due March 1st of 2020, and it was pretty much ready to go on March 1st of 2020. But everything was really going badly on March 1st, 2020. And it continued to go pretty badly for several months after that. And when there's an emergency, you have to yield to it. So in some ways, so we waited a few extra months to issue our plan. Not a big deal. I think that there is, in some ways, it supports the importance of our work. Like, for example, I talked about the State Disaster Recovery Task Force, and I staff our housing subcommittee, and that work just rolled into COVID. It was like nobody missed a beat because the issues were so similar, and the programs might look different, but it's still about, how can we get the money out quickly and in compliance? What community partners do we need? How do we build more affordable housing to support these needs? It was amazing how much the conversation, it's like we just picked it up and shifted it to a new context. So in some ways that it's been enlightening in a good way about how much of the resilience work that we do is actually building resilience to things like pandemic, or maybe even like economic downturn. And then there are other things that are harder. And I think the kind of bandwidth and attention for resilience was really high after we had a second hurricane. And after when we had a pandemic, it's like not quite as high because of the urgency of the fallout from the pandemic. And so in some ways, maybe some of the political window on that shrunk a little bit with the pandemic, or it just highlighted ways in which we need to make sure to tie our work to the pandemic, or not necessarily if it's not relevant, but to continue to bring back the importance of dealing with natural hazards and mitigating natural hazard damage.